Welcome back. So in this tutorial, I'll be continuing with our present series of unit testing and we'll be doing the part 3 today. So I strongly suggest that if you have not seen my first two parts, so please go through the first part and the second part before coming to this part, because this part is based on the first two parts. Ideally, you can start from part 3 also, but then you'll be skipping some parts, which is all right, not a problem. So in this lecture, we'll be taking the home controller tests in our sample project that I have shown how to download and install in our Visual Studio 2019. Now we'll understand the sample project unit tests on home controller action, get and post action methods, and we'll see the unit test naming best practice, some of the best practice for unit test naming convention, and we'll be debugging a unit tests. And also we'll be mocking objects and running tests using the XUnit test framework for this present sample project. So please stay tuned. And if you like my channel, please subscribe to it and click the bell notification icon. So whenever I upload a new video, you'll be instantly notified, and share the channel with as many friends as you can. That will help me. So here I'll be restricting myself to the home controller unit tests only, and in the next couple of lectures I'll be taking the session controller, and there is a ideas controller which is a web API type. So stay tuned. Now here in this home controller, which derives from the controller base class, we'll be studying this index action method, which returns a task of action result type. So as you can see that it is declaring a session list, which is a async list, and it is calling the select method to actually select a particular session from the Storm session view model with ID. Okay, and it is returning a view with passing the model. Now here you can see that the Storm session view model was created in the view model folder. Okay, and it carries just a few public properties with ID name and date created and ID account, number of ideas. And we have seen that in the second lecture, I think, when we cloned the project and installed it on our Visual Studio and ran it. Okay, so in this controller, it follows the explicit dependencies principle. So dependency is injected. An object of type iBrainstorm session repository type interface is injected into the home controller constructor. Okay, so what is an explicit dependency? So explicit dependency refers to the methods, the fact that the methods and classes should explicitly require any collaborating objects they need to function correctly. Now, class constructors provide an opportunity for classes to identify the things they need to be in a valid state and to function properly. If you define classes that can be constructed and called, but that will only function properly if certain global or infrastructure components are in place, then these classes are being dishonest with their clients, you see. So who are the clients? The methods or the classes calling those particular classes with those constructors. Now the constructor contract is telling the client that it only needs the things specified and possibly nothing if the class is just using a parameterless constructor, but then at runtime it turns out the object really did need something else. So by following the explicit dependencies principle, your classes and methods are being honest with their clients about what they need to function. And here it expects dependency injection to provide an instance of, as I said, iBrainstorm repository, iBrainstorm session repository class or interface rather. Now if you are new to dependency, now dependency is an object that another object depends on, and ASP.NET Core MVC controllers request dependencies explicitly via constructors. ASP.NET Core has built-in support for dependency injection, and dependency injection makes apps easier to test and maintain. And if for a full lecture on dependency injection, you can refer to this you can refer to this dependency injection course, or you can say this single video on ASP.NET Core dependency injection principle using Visual Studio in my channel, and I will put the link in the description. Now let's go dive straight to the testing control sample.test, and we'll be requiring this home controller.test.cs file. Okay, so let me put it in a horizontal new vertical document group so that we can see it side by side. Okay, so public class home controller test. Now this fact attribute, this is a part of the XUnit testing framework. So we have got several testing framework that Microsoft has used XUnit testing framework, which you can have a look in XUnit framework website, and you can see the packages that this project is using. So it is using a mock framework that we'll be talking in soon, and also XUnit 241 and XUnit.runner.visual studio. Okay, so in this home controller test project, which I have now made as a startup project for some reason that I'll be embarking upon soon. So you can see this fact is the test attribute for the method. Okay, now we see here that the home controller is being tested with the mocked, this mock class, mocked iBrainstorm session repository service using a mock object framework. Now, such as MOQ, this is using mock. Okay, now a mocked object is a fabricated object with a predetermined set of property and method behaviors used for testing. And a mock object allows us to copy or clone the behavior of a class and interface. This is used when interacting with test cases. Now, with the use of mocks, we can set up the object, including setting parameters, like we are setting that test. Okay, test method mock repo dot setup, and what is mock repo? New mock, and we are supplying the iBrainstorm session repository interface. So arrange, act, and assert. So if you have got any familiarity with unit test, arrange is the way to arrange the various fields and variables, and act is where you're calling a method like await on controller.index, and then assert is the last stage where you're actually testing the unit testing the method with some criteria like assert dot equal to, this is the actual, and this is the expected, and this is the actual behavior. Okay, now with the use of mocks, we can set up the objects, including setting parameters, as I was telling, and return values on the function calls. Also, we can verify that the methods we set up are being called during execution of the test cases. Now, let's see a document in a nutshell, which has got the best practices for the unit test, even though this topic is actually not covering the best practices. Just to tell you, the naming convention is a bit. So this is in this article, docs.microsoft.com and /NUS/.NET/core testing and unit testing best practices. Okay, so best practices. So naming your test, what Microsoft article says that the name of your test should consist of three parts: the name of the method being tested, the scenario under which it is being tested, and the expected behavior when that scenario is invoked. Now, why it is necessary? Because naming standards are important, as they explicitly express the intent of the test. Okay, because tests are not only just making sure that your code works, but they also provide documentation. So just by looking at the suite of unit tests, you should be able to infer the behavior of your code without even looking at the code itself. So additionally, when the tests fail, you can see exactly which scenarios do not meet your expectations. So by going with this notion of best practice, let's switch over to Visual Studio, and with our newfound knowledge for naming best practice, we can see that this test is named as index, returns a view result with the list of brainstorm sessions. So this is actually the unit test on index method, which is this, the get action index method, this one, and it is actually a returns as a view result list of brainstorm sessions. Okay, so because it was actually giving this list of brainstorm sessions, so session repository list async. Okay, and similarly, so this is the name of the unit test, and this is the behavior, and this is the return value. So remember, name, scenario, and expected behavior. So let me close this tab for actually getting more space. Now this will be even clearer when you look into two other test methods. Index post, so this is acting on the post method, returns bad request result when model state is invalid. So this is the index post method, and what was the scenario? When model state is invalid. And what was the return? It returns a bad request result. So similarly, the third one that we'll be studying today will be again for index post, and returns when model state is valid, this time it is valid, returns a redirect and adds session. So if you now have a fresh look at the these home controller.cs action method and put this side by side once again. So new vertical document group, and you can see that this post method has got two branches. When the model state is valid, or model state.isValid is true, and when it is not true. So when it is not true, it returns a bad request of 400, and if it is true, it adds a brainstorm session, add async, and also it returns a redirect to action calling the correct action name. All right. Now in this test sample project, the index action get, this is the get, HTTP verb get, and this is the post method. Okay, HTTP post. So by default, if you don't write HTTP get, it will automatically take that this is a HTTP get. So you are not giving any argument to the index method. Now here it has no looping. You see, this is straightforward. Okay, no looping or branching, and it only calls one method. Okay, to list sessions. Okay, so it is to list async. It is calling the session repository and dot list async to get a session list. Okay, so here we have already covered the naming test. Now remember, at the start of the session I told you we will be debugging a unit test. Okay, so I have covered this, I have covered this part, and I have covered this part a little bit, and we'll be covering it further. So how will we debug? So let's get back to Visual Studio again. Now remember, at the start of this tutorial somewhere, I have actually made this tests project, test controller sample.test project, as the startup project rather than this web project testing controller sample, which I did last time to show the how it looks on the browser. Okay, with the session and session ID and the tasks. But the reason was that I wanted to debug. So for debugging and running the test explorer to show you the tests passing or failing, I had to make it the startup project, which will be now utilized. Now for debugging, let me debug this first test. This is for the, which action method does it test? It tests the index get action method. So I will put the, I have put the breakpoint over here, and what I will do now, I'll click on this test and I will debug all tests. I'll click on debug all tests and then see what happens. So I've got a test explorer. Okay, so this text explorer is there and it is doing something, it's loading something, and let it come back. So now after a few seconds, this test explorer, this debugger breakpoint is hit, okay, on this test project. So if you run through this debugger, if you go for F10 or F11, so you can see the various values on the watch window, or just hovering your mouse over it. Okay, so if you see now, mock repo is null. Okay, now it is getting set up. F10 mock repo.setup. It is creating a calling the list async method, and then the next line, now here the controller is set up. Okay, this is something, controller object is not null. And similarly, if you now, at the moment it's not much use, but if you run through this with the F10 or F11, then you can come to the point where you have got this model. Okay, so all we are doing with the, remember, with the mock framework or with the mock object. Okay, so here you can see the current is null, results view. So you've got two objects. Okay, so date created, this particular date, ID 1, ID account 0, and name is test1. Okay, and similarly you've got another model, test2. Now where do they come from? Now they come from this method, actually, get sessions method. So that is not a test, actually, this is a method which returns a list of brainstorm session, and you've got two sessions added over here on the in-memory collection. Now remember, I have told you in the previous lecture that this project, samples project, doesn't use a database, real database, but it uses the in-memory collection of the entity framework core. All right, so now if you run, if you continue, click on continue, and you can see model.count, there will be, it should be passing the test, because there are two models already that I have shown you. If you just browse if you just scroll through with F10 again, hitting the F10, so model.count, what is the model count? There is two counts. Okay, results because 0 and 1, that is what I have shown. It is coming from this get test session. Now if you click on continue, let's see what happens. See here, the test explorer comes back again, and this test we are running, this is the highlighted test, index returns a view result with a list of brainstorm session, and it has passed, right? Green tick. So that's great. We have just learned how to debug unit test through the Visual Studio Debugger. Now lastly, we'll see that there are two tests for the post method, which I have mentioned earlier in this lecture. You know, this post action method it could be distributed, it could be divided into two parts, when the model state is invalid or model state dot is valid is false, and the next case when it is true. So when it is false, if the model state is invalid, it is false, it is invalid, then what happens? Then you are still arranging the mock repo with iBrainstorm session repository interface, and you are pretty much similarly arranging it as you have arranged it for this part, for the index get verb part. But here you are calling the add model error method on the model state, and you are passing the session name and the required, these two strings. Okay, and you are returning bad request dot value, means you are returning a 400 error. Okay, or 400 bad request as a response. However, when the model is valid, what happens with the model state is valid? So when the model state is valid, you still have this arrange, act, and assert blocks, which are the foundation blocks of a unit test. And what you are doing is you are adding asynchronously a brainstorm session. Okay, you are adding a brainstorm session, and finally you are redirecting. You are calling the redirect to action, and you are redirecting it to the correct method, that is the index method. Now one thing to be reminded of here is that the test doesn't attempt to pass in an invalid model. So passing an invalid model isn't a valid approach, since model binding isn't running. Now mocked calls that aren't called are normally ignored. Okay, but calling verifiable at the end with this mock repo.verify code at the end of this setup, it allows mock validation in the test. This is performed with the call to this verify method which fails the test if the expected method wasn't called. Now that's pretty much the end of this tutorial. So in this tutorial, we have seen what is a mock object, how to use the XUnit test framework, and what is the naming best practice, and how to debug a unit test in Visual Studio. Thank you.